years ago, I worked at a particular job where I was well liked. I was considered one of the most likable blokes on the team. All my workmates, as a result, confided with me things that had occurred to them, as well as circumstances that had happened in their lives. That's the sort of man that I am. A dependable and trustworthy man is something that can be few and far in between in this modern world, as I learned that everybody just wants to vent sometimes, to let details of themselves out for others to know. But there was one time that I was at that particular job, I had heard something from a coworker that I would ever really forget. But one particular day, I was in the break room having a conversation with a coworker, as he was actually in the particular job temporarily, as his real intentions was to get into an engineering-based occupation. He was skilled with machines, and he had clear talent, as when it came to fixing machines, basic maintenance of machines, even suggestions as to what kind of machine you would own, personalized situation, you'd ask him, and he gave you his opinions on the topic. Straight to the point of the discussion, the conversation we had were about cars. Also, he had a particular model that was a little bit older, not like the modern cars, which what he considered to be basically computers on wheels. He never drove a modern car, he preferred the older models that could be repaired with a person's touch. The both of us were sitting at a table, and then he leaned towards me a bit as he spoke, almost so no others could hear, even though there were no other co-workers in the break room with us at the time. He explained that at a previous job of his, he had to often drive a fair amount of distance from where he had lived to the said job, but the benefits on pay were good, so he didn't really care. But eventually, the commute ended up being something he couldn't deal with. So one day when he was driving back to his home after a hard day of work, he had someone cut him off while he was trying to get off the road for his exit. It had been a particularly busy day for him at the job, and he was naturally very angry about this. So he leaned back in his chair and tapped on the table a few times with his fingers. And he mentioned to me that he was not going to let the person get away with it. He decided to drive after the bloke, tailing him, seeing where he would go to, before he saw the person eventually head into a residential area and parked. One of those particularly posh types of neighborhoods, where the people living in it always thought that money solved their problems. Saying that, he pulled his car to the side of the street, turned off the engine, and glanced at the person's house. He thought about just driving away. My coworker figured that this was the sort of moron who drove the streets and freeways, cutting off other motorists all the time. It was that time of night where most were already at their homes, and few if any were outside. The coworker told me that he had sat in his car watching the person's home, just looking at it, scanning it, and even to see who might be around it. As he turned the ignition off from his car, got out, went to the boot of his car, got out a hat to partially cover his face, as well as some tools that he put into his back pocket, and decided to head into the person's driveway. My coworker sat back in his chair and looked towards the break room entrance, silent for a moment just in case any other worker came in. No one did. His glance then went back to me, as he continued his story. The coworker told me that he went to the side of the house, up the driveway, and checked out the car. It was one of those expensive models, as he didn't even bother to put it in the garage, he just let it sit in the driveway, possibly to show it off to people. He mentioned to me that he doubted that the driver even fully knew how to drive the cars. By the look of it, it wasn't being driven to its full potential. The coworker explained to me that a good amount of modern cars have technical features that aren't fully used by most of their drivers. As the coworker told me, using his knowledge with machines, he was soon able to figure out how to mess with the car without its alarm sounding. That he then reached for one of the tools that he had in his back pocket and popped the bonnet of the car open. He then glanced at the engine and actually leaned in to mess with the wiring. I then nodded my head and thought about it, but I soon asked him if it was something that he did quickly because someone might have noticed him. He explained further that depending on the brand, or even the model, some parts were pre-assembled in Asia and completed in the country where the driver is purchasing it from. Due to the cheap assembly methods in Asia compared to the quality standards of Europe and the United States, those connection wires or pieces can actually be messed with and could also cause accidents. My coworker then leaned forward in his chair. looking to the break room doorway as he continued to speak with me. When parts of a car vibrate or perform their actions or functions, it's still more or less an engine on pieces get worn out, dislodged, or are broken. But my coworker glanced back to me as I was nodding my head in listening response. So after using his tool to mess with some of the wires in the car's engine, he then closed the bonnet. Giving a quick glance around him, then he quickly headed back out of the driveway and back to his own car, tossed his hardened tools into the boot of his own car, then drove away, back to his own home. I rubbed my chin with one of my hands, deciding to rest both my elbows on the table, and looked at him. I asked if he thought by messing with the engine if the bar driver would have gotten into an accident as a result. My coworker mentioned that with the tampering he did, that the bar driver would have undoubtedly gotten into some sort of accident eventually, but due to the randomness of machines on manufacturing of modern cars, it would be impossible to know when and how the bad driver would get into an accident. With his story concluded, there was a pause between us, that I didn't blame him for what he had done. I mentioned that at the time I remembered news agencies proclaiming that there were more unskilled or subpar drivers on the roads of the country, or even the world, more than ever before. I said that sometimes when you're a bad driver, you deserve the consequences of what you do behind the wheel. Before he stood up and nodded his head in agreement to what I had said. The coworker mentioned to me that was why he did it at all. If there were any accidents to occur, let it be with those careless drivers, not those who respect the cars that they drive and fellow motorists that they share the road with. As he then left the break room to head back and continue his shift. I sat there in the break room alone for a moment, before I myself decided to get up and head to one of the windows in the break room. Glancing outside, I saw rows and rows of cars in the employee parking lot. As I noticed that the area was full today, I narrowed my eyes a bit with what I had just seen, thinking that the coworker might have actually been right. There are too many cars and drivers in this modern world.